to quit smoking in the 50s would have been very hard in this country because it was a virtually ubiquitous habit and the machines were selling them everywhere and the ads are when it was normalized. Now it's much, much easier. You get a lot more support. You won't have to spell it and all that, but we can't get away from these devices. As you say, we need them to function. So anything that can work over that, there's gambling, there's also pornography, you have to be I don't know, it's almost beyond human to never get into that.
Right. And this is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. We look at the big invisible forces that are threatening to sweep us all out to sea, take us right off our feet. And today, the big invisible force that we're talking about is addiction. In my life, one of the big invisible forces for years and years, decades, was alcohol. I remember once in my 20s, I had this pattern back then of doing real sabotage to myself, typically with booze, right before I had something important to do professionally. I'll have to talk to some therapists some more about this. But I remember in one case in particular in my 20s, I had just finished one project, but I had another really important one the next day, and yet I stayed up all night partying with friends. And the next morning I had to drive to that project, and I remember taking this left onto the highway, and the bus that I cut off honked at me, which is very unusual in Seattle. Nobody honks at anybody. And I remember coming to this realization of realizing, wow, I'm drunk. I shouldn't be behind the wheel of this car, even though this feels like the morning in my normal commute. This is in fact not good. And that was the beginning of many, many warning signs over the course of my life. And it took me, unfortunately, years to recognize them, that I had a problem with alcohol and I needed to stop. And for me, it has been I keep coming back to these memories of addiction so much because, and I'll talk in this podcast about how it is I went on to quit drinking, but I think so much about addiction right now because I think we're all talking about it all the time. Because not only is there, of course, this just tidal wave of drug addiction in this country, but there is all this new stuff. There's gambling, there's sports gambling on your phone, and there's the phone in general, which all of us are really grappling with. And so I wanted to bring in a real expert in addiction, somebody I've known for many years, Dr. Keith Humphreys. He is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford. He does research at the Veterans Administration, and he's also got an appointment at King's College London. He's written a bunch of fascinating things, more than 400 peer-reviewed articles. But I'm drawing in this interview from a 2023 book that he has that is just explaining what addiction is. I really recommend picking it up. And in this conversation, we talk about all the different ways in which our ancient circuitry puts us into a really vulnerable position when it comes to drugs and other forms of behavior and abusive relationships to those behavior. And we talk about possible paths forward, ways that we might get out of this. I talked about this a lot on social media before this episode, and I asked a lot of people for a lot of questions. I got a lot of questions submitted. Everybody's thinking about this right now. And so I hope you get as much as I did from this hour-long conversation with Dr. Keith Humphreys. Keith Humphreys, thank you so much for being on The Rip Current.
Really good to see you again, Jake.
You wrote this 2023 book that tries to sort of decode addiction for an audience like me. And as I was reading it, I saw that you go to great lengths to define addiction because it's so different from other medical diagnoses and so complicated. And so give us some sense of it. Like, how do we think about the moment when a habit veers into addiction and a psychiatrist like you gets involved?
Yeah, so it's helpful. Let's start with the very common sense usage that people have for addiction and why it's not what I talk about when I talk about addiction. So people say, I'm addicted to my phone, or I'm addicted to secession, I got to see it, and all that. What they mean is, I like it a lot and I do it a lot. But that's not addiction, because central to addiction is harm. So, if you are someone I work out every day, but it's, you're healthy, your life is going fine, it's not competing with other things. We would call addiction, that's something you choose to do a lot. That's really fine. But what's going on with addiction is person is repeatedly engaging in a behavior despite destructive consequences, usually to them, also often to other people around them. And they have difficulty controlling how often they do it. So it's not a sense as much of I like as it is I want. And sometimes as people get further along, part of what's really mysterious about it is they may even not like it that much. It just feels like they must. Now, let me just pick up on one other point you said. It is different, though, from a lot of things in medicine. It's not like a broken bone. It's not like a tumor where I can show it a picture. There, see that, Jake? That's your addiction. That's right there, and you're up by your shoulder.
Right, we're going to throw a cast around that, and in 6 weeks you'll be okay.
Yeah, and I'll know that you're okay because then I can look at the picture again. Instead, what we've got is a lot. A lot of things we can observe. Person's doing this thing over and over. It's hurting them. They keep doing it anyway. Subjectively, it feels like they're out of control. They're thinking about it all the time. They're either doing it or recovering from it all the time. But I can't show you that physical thing. Instead, it's basically a hypothesis that all this is part of some real substrate that we can't at this point identify. But we call that, addiction, or in proper medical, parlance, we would call it a use disorder, like cocaine use disorder, alcohol use disorder, something like that. Yeah.
And as I understood it from your book, this is playing on very ancient reward circuitry, reinforcement circuitry, but really has only come to pass in terms of addiction, in terms of the drugs that you are mostly concerned with, very recently, right? This is a very modern thing, and so tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So why are we here? Why is Homo sapiens still here? If you went back in time and you were going to place a bet on the various creatures you could see of who's going to have ancestors a million years from now, you would
the little squishy, toothless,
wimpy,
flawless us. No way.
Yeah.
No
They
way.
can't fly. They don't have sharp teeth, but they do have something. If you were looking, obviously they're already making tools, right? And pretty soon they're going to be making plans, and they seem to have a memory, and they learn stuff. And they are able to change their behavior in anticipation without directly, making a mistake over and over. They can sort of foresee it and learn, which a lot of animals can't do. And that's it. It's what we've got up here. That's why we're alive. How does that work? Well, it works through a chemical signaling system that tells us important things like, hey, what you just did was that was good. Be sure to try to do that again when you can. So, for example, things like, you're cold and you get warm. You're hungry and you eat, and that helped us survive. That same architecture, which works on, I think the neurotransmitter most people have heard of is dopamine, but which gives us that signal down through a particular region of the brain, nucleus accumbens, and says, do that again, happens to be activated very strongly by all the drugs to which we become addicted. And we can measure that and observe it, in people, and that the amount of the spike and how fast it happens far exceeds things that are super important, like to our species, like having sex, taking care of our young, getting warm when we're cold, and eating.
So the high that comes off of those chemicals outstrips the high you get from just the basic stuff of survival.
Yes, right. And so one way to think of it, some people want to argue, is it a disease or not? I think I'm not interested in the word, but just one way to think of what is going on. You could think of it as like deeply maladaptive learning.
You're learning the wrong reinforcement. You're learning the wrong. You're learning to be excited about the wrong thing.
That's right. So I haven't eaten in 2 days, and I have $5, and everything in me should say buy food, and instead I buy a powder that is non-nutritive and I inhale it. It's like, why am I doing that? Because that reward is greater. And so that's what's going on in addiction. And in terms of the point you made about, why didn't this wipe us out a long time ago? Well, you could have got addicted to plant-based versions of, things like tobacco, thousands of years ago. But we haven't really had, first of all, these drugs didn't even exist until about the age of chemistry in the late 19th century. So that means cocaine, benzodiazepines, amphetamine, methamphetamine, they don't exist. And then also we developed, and then through global commerce, spread much more potent ways of taking drugs into our body, like the hypodermic needle, which is in the 1850s. Or a really big example would be the Camel cigarette, which was the most profitable product of the 20th century. Tobacco in its wild form is pretty harsh if you inhale it. So most people, it doesn't feel too good. And, my colleague Robert Proctor, who studies the tobacco industry, says in 1900, in the entire history of medicine around the whole world, there were only 7 cases documented of lung cancer from smoking.
Wow. I think of people at that time as just smoking like chimneys.
Yeah.
And therefore, I would assume they're dropping dead left and right from lung cancer.
Yeah, but what they're smoking is a really harsh tobacco that's hard to inhale, and therefore they don't pull it deeply down into their lungs.
Right. You got to be really hardcore
Yeah.
to
Yes.
give yourself lung cancer with that stuff. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So-
It wasn't until commerce and
Chemistry.
customer service, or whatever you want to call it, made it smooth. It's the
it's
smooth pause that refreshes.
That's right. So it was curing tobacco longer, which increases the sugar content, makes it sweeter, and also blending it with like Turkish tobaccos with American tobaccos. That's what Camel was. And that is why instead of having 7 cases of lung cancer from smoking in the history of medicine, there's probably 7 every minute somewhere on this earth. And why? Because now you can inhale it really deeply, which means 1, you're exposing your whole lung to all these carcinogens, but 2, that goes straight to the brain really, really fast. Your lungs are super efficient. And then the brain says, that was great. Do that again, Keith. Do that again, Keith. Do that again, Keith. And very obviously, the people did that again, with enormous consequences for global mortality and morbidity.
Right. And to the tune of billions of dollars in profit. That's right.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
right.
easily. I mean, another point, Robert Proctor makes is if you could have invested $1 in 1900 in any American industry, you should have invested it in tobacco, and the returns exceeded the railroads, oil, real estate, all the things we think of as big money makers. There was no product as profitable as the cigarette, and because there is no customer like an addicted customer.
Like an addicted one. I mean, so this is going to take us to, the broad theme of this conversation, I think, is going to have to do a lot with the sort of interplay of addiction and commerce, because that's really where we're at. And your book mentions this several times, that we're at this place of the product is the addiction more and more. It feels like to me. I cover technology for a living, right? And so that has certainly been true in experience in talking about technology, and we'll talk about that later in the hour. But for me, when you think about the genesis of this stuff, is there a pretty well identified point in your mind when someone says, "Oh, we're going to throw a little marketing at this," or "Oh, we're going to throw a filter onto these cigarettes," where that becomes that's where it really begins to become problematic? Like, do we need commerce for addiction to become the global problem that it has become?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of people talk about the same period where addiction comes as the age of advertising, when it became a dominant industry and promotion of all kinds of things, far more efficient than just the guy with his patent medicine saying, "Try Dr. Humphreys' magical elixir," kind of thing.
or the poor farmer who smokes the horrible old tobacco, and everyone around him goes, "God, that stuff is awful. He's a wreck. We're not going to be like him." That's right. It's not till you have Ronald Reagan lighting up and looking great with a cigarette that people really start to think.
And of course, you have radio. Is developed around this period, and then mass market magazines. It's also the founder of really fusing commercial advertising to physicians is the Sackler family. So initially with Valium, but then later, of course, very famously with OxyContin,
with the opioids.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
And a global access base. So that's transportation is really an important part of this. Let's just imagine that genes do influence risk. Okay, so let's say you had the genes that made cocaine feel better to you than the average person. So if you used it, you'd be more likely to get addicted. That was irrelevant for most of human history, unless you happen to live in a very narrow region, right? In the northern part of South America, where the coca plant is based, right?
Right.
And you couldn't even process it into what we think of as cocaine now until 150 years ago, but it still wouldn't have mattered because you couldn't have gotten it if you lived in Africa or
Right,
North
you're so
America.
far away, right? There's no way.
Right.
Yeah.
But now cocaine is everywhere, as is tobacco, and when you get to other types of addictions, like, say, gambling, that don't require a substance that's ingested, it's in our pockets, all of us.
Yeah, that's right. This reminds me, this mention of the global marketplace reminds me of another point that jumped out at me from your book, which is you mentioned that rates of addiction in countries that live in poverty or in a sort of middle class existence, the rates of addiction in those countries are lower than they are the wealthier a country becomes. That blew my mind. That I had not put together. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So many people, say, well, of course, we know poverty is an unpleasant experience. So their sort of assumption would be, well, the poor countries must be getting destroyed right now by cocaine or by fentanyl and all that. But no, it's the rich countries, and that's because this is commerce. You got to spend a lot of money. I mean, tobacco.
Right. You got to have money to
Yes.
to buy the things that will become a problem in your life.
That's right. Yeah. And so, the disposable income is just beyond, we spend more, a smoker in America spends more on tobacco than the average person in a lot of the world makes in a year. Right? So there's that. But as countries get richer, then they start consuming more. So if you look at these booming nations like, the BRICS, as they're called, they're now much bigger consumers of whiskey and cigarettes, right? Because they're getting more disposable income and they buy it. Which again, let's go back to the brain thing. That kind of shows this is clearly something Homo sapiens values a lot, such that when you get a little extra dollars, you buy that, as opposed to fruits and vegetables.
A more stable food supply. Right. Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
That's right. That reminds me, a friend of mine who studies wrote a book about the history of alcohol was telling me about the arc, and I hadn't put these two things together until you just said it, but the incredible surge in demand in Asian countries for aged whiskeys. And it evidently created this incredible problem for the manufacturers of those whiskeys because they were running out, and you can't suddenly age more
Yes.
12-year Macallan. So they were having trouble, and so that it created this this technological rush to try to come up with ways to more rapidly age booze through things like putting the barrel in the ocean so it rocks endlessly, and it gets agitated constantly, and all these things. But the scramble to try and keep up with that is so interesting, right? The point at which that there's an inflection point past which people have a little bit of disposable income, and that's when the ancient evolutionary circuitry gets hijacked, or whatever the thing is, and becomes focused not on, like you say, a comfier bed or fruits and vegetables, but on ancient, aged booze that'll impress your friends and get you drunk. That is crazy.
Yeah.
That is crazy to me. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about how difficult it is for Americans to even tolerate the idea that we become addicted to something. We'll be right back. I want to talk now about why Americans hate to admit they are addicted to things. I don't know if you agree with this thesis, but this is my thesis. I want to bounce it off you. I find that Americans have such a difficult time admitting any sort of powerlessness in their behavior. When I try to point out to people that people are becoming addicted, for instance, so I did a whole story about social casino gambling. Anybody who's listened to this podcast before has heard me talk about this before. Social casino gambling is a whole industry in which you are basically getting people a simulator of casino games that you have to pay to play, but you can't win any real money. You just get addicted on your phone. So it's the ultimate loser's game. It has talk about having no, survival benefit or nutritive purpose or any of that. Like, it's a totally pointless game. And people are losing their life savings playing this game. Typically elderly, lonely women get picked out, found on Facebook. And the plaintiffs who have come together in these class actions were for years getting laughed out of court about it. The judges just did not want to hear about it and just thought, you dummies, you can't do that. And it reminds me also of how people used to talk about obesity and just say, you can just be smarter about this. You can just make better choices. And I'm curious for you, like, what is your opinion of sort of our cultural tolerance for addictive behavior in one another?
Many people have observed, and I think correctly, that the United States is a very individualistic society, perhaps the most individualistic society, in which self-control is central to self-respect. So if I say, I am incapable of controlling my own behavior, my God, I I try to have one drink and I end up having 15. I went shopping. I only had 10. I spent 1,000 that I don't have, and the reaction to that is very punitive. It's like you've really failed as a person.
It's a moral judgment. There's a moral quality to it.
Absolutely. You're not a good American. You're not in control of yourself. And this is different, by the way. In a lot of other cultures, addiction is seen much more as a family problem, that we're sort of all in this together and people come into care together. But not in America. It's like your own individual thing to sort out, and it's embarrassing if you can't. You mentioned about weight. I mean, I am struck by these drugs like the GLP-1 agonist drugs, which really help people lose a lot of weight. There's a core of people who are quite angry about these drugs.
Yes, I have noticed this too. Very upset about it. That's right. I mean, one person I will say who is upset about it, who's talked to me about being upset about it, is my cousin who has type 1 diabetes. And she says, this is a condition I cannot, that I can't change. There's no drug I can take that will change my relationship to diabetes. So for her, the Ozempic craze is very frustrating in this broader sense. But you're right. I mean, people. I can't tell you how often I have that conversation now that you mentioned it. Like people saying, it's not actually changing your self-control. It's just an easy way out.
Yes, right. It's cheap. It's a cheap trick you're doing.
Right.
You ought to be able to do it. And people get sort of ejected from overweight friendship groups because she snuck off and used that. And then people lying about it also. I've been going to the gym, really eating healthy because they know it's like you've got this crutch, you've got this Ozempic. And we do apply that. It's interesting. We don't apply it to lots of other things. People aren't ashamed when they take chemotherapy for cancer or actually plenty of other medications are shameful.
Aspirin for a headache. That's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
But ones that in some way touch how Americans think about your individual self-control over your behavior become very emotionally hot. And people feel ashamed when, they need that kind of in that case, pharmacological support. Yeah.
I mean, I would say it even extends so far as when Narcan first came around, and you and I became acquainted, I think, when this was first happening, when Narcan first became a thing, right? So naloxone is a drug that detaches the opioids essentially from the brain. Just, I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but that's how I think of it, right?
It's basic
and
idea,
that interruption helps, reverse an overdose, or reverse somebody being poisoned by it, and stopping breathing and everything that comes with the opioid overdose. And I have heard people say that drug shouldn't be available to people with an opioid problem because how will they ever learn?
Right.
Which is the logic of that is so medieval, that they should somehow die instead, so that because then they'll learn.
They'll suffer the consequences for their cheap pleasure-seeking ways.
Right, for their failings.
Yeah,
that is so interesting, and you're right but it's funny to me that it's the United States, which has both, revolutionized the commerce of addiction, and also totally hates on each other. We totally hate on each other for falling prey to that very industry we basically pioneered and refined.
I mean, it's sort of like cultural contradictions of capitalism. You can listen to politicians, complain Americans aren't saving enough money. They're all expecting Social Security to take care of them, and then see an ad from the state of California telling you to try the lottery. Paid for by your tax dollars. Yeah. Right.
Well, this brings me to the thing that's happening right now that makes me so crazy, which is the rise of sports gambling in the United States, which is not, I mean, this is the thing I think that it's important for everybody to understand. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I see it, addiction is not going the right way in this country. We are not getting better at this, at least, or at the very least, we're not limiting the commerce of addiction the way you would expect we would, considering how widespread the problem is. So gambling, just for anybody who knows, right? So sports gambling on your phone is now legal in more than 30 states. I think it's even more than that now. And I remember a colleague of mine at NBC had just come from being at the event where one city hands off to another city. It was New Orleans handing off to, I think, Arizona. I don't follow football, so I don't know. But it was the where the Super Bowl was going to be, and whoever the governor of the state was that was at this thing said, and remember, gambling on football is legal here in whatever it was, Arizona or whatever, people, and those states taking in tons of money on that stuff. And to me, when I found out that was going that way, that states are actively participating, states that in theory are supposed to, help provide health care to their citizens, they're actively participating in making sure that there's more opportunity to blow your money on sports gambling.
Yes.
I was astounded.
It's awful. And the technology makes it so much harder to get away from, again, this complete saturation. So I have a friend, a British journalist, Dominic Lawson, who has covered this, and he profiled this guy who was trying to quit his compulsive sports gambling, but he forgot that when he had agreed to that long thing you agree to when you install an app and you don't read, it said, we're allowed to track you wherever you are. So he moved to another city, and then he gets a message saying, we see you're now in this new city. Do you know there's a great match in this city tonight? Would you like to place a bet at 10% off?
Come on.
So this is like the bottle following you home from the bar and chasing after you.
I talked to a guy who was a very serious gambling addict. He was some sort of graduate student. I kept his name anonymous in the report I did, but he was a graduate student of some kind. He blew like $200,000, that he did not have on sports gambling on his phone. And he said that being a sports gambling addict in recovery, now that it's on the phone, is like being an alcoholic who's been forced to carry a fifth of vodka everywhere he goes. Yeah. That it's just an absolutely impossible thing. And you can't function in society if you don't have the phone. So there's no option for him other than to be tempted constantly. In that case.
Yes. I mean, it's sort of opposite of what's happened with smoking. I mean, to quit smoking in the 50s would have been very hard in this country because it was a virtually ubiquitous habit, and the machines were selling them everywhere, and the ads it was normalized. Now it's much, much easier. You get a lot more support. You won't have to spell it and all that, but we can't get away from these devices. As you say, we need them to function. So anything that can work over that, there's gambling, there's also pornography, you have to be it's almost beyond human to never get into that.
Right. And yet we are correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't it take 30 years plus for the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual that folks like you use, to even include gambling as an addiction? It took forever for us to decide that was the case.
Yeah, it's taken a long time for that. And then also these sort of, newer kinds of gaming,
video games. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I can understand that there is a tension, right? We don't want to pathologize everything people do a lot as an addiction, and sort of because they say someone has a disease that could have consequences for them in their social life, in their employment, in their insurance, all that sort of thing. And at the same time, you see people burning down their lives over these new sort of not behavioral addictions, as sometimes.
So with gambling, what is the, tell me a little bit about why you think it's what is that tension? Why did it take so long, considering that that's an industry that's, it seems to me, based on what I've read and the lawsuits I've seen, is really built to, gambling is really built to make itself a habit, to make itself as compulsive a thing as possible in your life. I don't know, and I don't think of it as a little gentleman's wager, that sort of stuff.
God, no.
That's not how it works.
If you, this may seem strange for an addiction person, but I usually go to Vegas at least once a year. And
I love that. Yeah. Do you really? Yeah. That's fantastic. I love this.
It's not because I enjoy the gambling, but I enjoy everything else. I enjoy the food, the shows, and I enjoy watching. It's fascinating as a place, right?
Yeah.
And there's a book, Addiction by Design. I think it's Patricia Shull. I hope I get that name.
Natasha Dow Shull.
Thank you, Natasha Shull.
Yeah, she's one of my heroes. In fact, here. This is it.
There you go.
It's sitting right here. It's one of my Bibles. This book, incredible. So for anybody who doesn't know, Natasha Dow Shull spent years and years and years doing what I consider to be a totally intolerable journalistic assignment, which is she spent all this time with what are called machine gaming, so slots, addicts, people who could not stop playing slot machines. And she just spent all this time with those people and learned so much about both their lives and about the industry. So go ahead.
Yeah, it's a tremendous book. I mean, so one of the points she makes in there, and you see this in Vegas, is the card tables have virtually disappeared to be replaced by machines.
Oh, like, wow.
It's like, why is that? Because a machine can perfectly give you the exact amount of reinforcement and the exact speed from your behavior to the reward that is maximally reinforcing, whereas a dealer might be slower or faster.
Yeah, it has to go home eventually.
Yeah, that's right.
And you got to pay that person to come back. That's right.
Yeah, that's right. So they never get tired. And that's even why they got rid of the pool slot thing, sort of old timey. Again, that sets the timing of the reinforcement off. It's much quicker if you just press it. And
people call that friction. You're trying to eliminate friction.
You're trying to eliminate friction. And the other concept I love is just the cognitive trick in the industry as a term for, LDW, losses described as wins. So you put in a buck and it says you have 100 credits. And then you pull this thing or you press this button, and then all these weird things, these lights go off, and they say, "You've won 10, you've won 20, you've won another 20. Wow, triple win! You've just lost 50, right?" But the impression, like, I won 50. It's like, yeah, you paid 100 to win 50. So you should just look at that rationally and say, "Wow, I just burnt half my money in a split second." But
that's right.
Instead, it's telling you, giving you all these signals, and it works.
Her other thing, she told me about it because I've spoken to her several times because I'm such a fan. But she also told me that winning in slots, like when the jackpot happens, the dreamy moment when the coins come pouring forth, turns out to be an irritation to the player. They don't like it because it breaks the opiate flow of being in the machine zone, that she calls it. And what's so crazy is that the industry calls it machine zone. And I actually bumped into a company once that makes these kinds of things, and they call themselves Machine Zone. That's the name of the company, because they know how all this works, which is why the responsible gaming, they say at the end of commercials for gaming, game responsibly, just like they say, drink responsibly, which again goes back to this thing you were saying, that we put it on people to control themselves, even as we're perfecting this industry that is so good at making us addicted. So what is, I mean, I don't want to make you get into stuff you don't necessarily know about, but like, why did it take so long with gambling? Why do you think that was such a slog?
Well, I think older than you and probably older than most of your listeners. So the change is really remarkable. So when I was a kid, Pete Rose was the legendary baseball player. He set the record for the most hits, over 4,000, and he was denied going into the Hall of Fame because he placed a bet on a baseball game that he, on his own side, he was not cheating. He was just betting on himself.
I'd win. I bet we'll win. Right?
Yeah. And he was banned from the Hall of Fame. Now, you can't watch a game for 5 seconds without seeing these ads. And I think it's a combination of two things. One is the increasing secularity of the United States. So, the big forces against a lot of, the sort of dialogue between commerce and health has often, the times when America's resisted, has often been out of its religious traditions, like the prohibitionist movement, or just if you just look, there still is actually kids who are raised religious do, in fact, use less tobacco, alcohol, cigarettes, and so on. Well, America's a lot more secular. And then the second thing is the triumph of industry over regulation. I mean, they've captured it very effectively. We could, we talking about gambling, we could also say about cannabis. And, they're very good at lobbying. We have laws that let you give enormous sums of money to shape campaigns. And very often, that is dispositive. And was very quick with gambling. Even in the face of every evaluation that's been done showed just like epic rates of bankruptcy, from this stuff. Its effect is so strong, it's just obvious it was a mistake. And yet, try to control it in any way. And, and a massive industry is right there to stop you.
So it's not, unfortunately, as simple as the science shows that this thing is super addictive and super harmful, and thus it'll be in the manual, and we'll just start building policy about that. Of course, it is more complicated than that.
Right. That's right. Yes. It is also actually, people will say, and of course it's true, there's people like me who can go to Vegas for once a year and blow $20 and say, well, that was all right. And they point to me and say, see, it's not a problem.
Right.
Look at that.
I mean, this is I think the problem with our political moment, right? Is that nobody believes in anything except anecdotal evidence. Didn't happen to me, so I don't know anything about this.
Yeah.
Didn't happen to my friends, so I don't know anything about this.
And it also goes back to the self-control thing. So in the end, like, there's not a, why should this is not a social problem. This is an individual failing. Why should Keith's once-a-year Vegas trip be ruined because this other guy can't seem to control this other guy lost $200,000? Is that you're punishing Keith for that?
Right.
And again, I go back, a different understanding, and this would be something that would have been more dominant in a more religious society. Is we give up some things for the benefits of everybody. It's sort of like, maybe I could do it, but there's certain things I might sacrifice for the good of the whole, and for the person who's struggling, and so on. And that sensibility, gets weaker and weaker as society gets more individualistic and as society gets more capitalistic. And those two things, I think all the evidence is that those two things are very strongly allied. The most individualistic societies on the planet are also the richest.
So when we come back, we're going to talk about the path out of addiction. Is there one? And we're going to talk a little bit about the rise of cannabis, the new mega industry in the United States. We'll be right back. So I quit drinking in 2016. And this is not a very dramatic story, but I'll just tell you the story. Basically, when Trump was elected, I had just come off of a big documentary series that was supposed to be about human behavior, and we thought at the time in making this documentary series for PBS, it's called Hacking Your Mind, for anybody who wants to watch it.
I saw it. It's very good.
Oh, you've seen it? Oh, good. Oh, that's nice. It was a really life-changing thing for me because I got to travel the world and interview all these behavioral experts, and I was very naive about how people make decisions. I was very moralistic. I thought it was all about self-control and so forth. But I also had a drinking problem without really realizing that I had it. And it, I think there are, I always say to people, when they ask me about quitting drinking, I try to always say my problem was not as serious as many other people's problems. And so I don't want to in any way, sort of give the I don't want to equate my experience with anybody else's, because other people I think have had a lot more trouble quitting than I did. But what it was definitely doing to me was it was exacerbating what is my real mental health problem, which is depression. I'm somebody who really thinks things through, and in a very dark way a lot of the time. My mom calls it catastrophizing. It's a good word. I do a lot of that. And it turns out that if I don't sleep well, I really start to slide into that. And for me, booze was connected to that. I just didn't sleep well. The compound effects of drinking created the compound effects of not sleeping well. So when Trump was elected, I looked at this and I was like, this is going to be a really depressing period, because I had just seen all of this stuff that we had learned in this documentary series basically getting ignored in democracy. And here comes Trump. And I just realized I'm going to need to, take a break here and stop. And I stopped for a month. And then I was really hoping it would make no difference in my life. And it turned out to make an enormous difference in my life. And I was like, fuck, that's too bad. Dude, that's too bad. Now I got to stop. And I was reminded over and over again by what people in the behavioral science world had said to me, which is good decisions do not feel good. A lot of the time they do not come with a chemical reward. And so that's too bad. And so, every day, I've heard people who've been through the 12 steps say, it's a daily decision. It's not one decision, it's 10,000 decisions. And that for me has been true. It's an ongoing renegotiation, and Christmas rolls around, or I'm in some, nice bar to see a band or something. And I'll think, man, is this the day? Is this the day? And then I stop. Right. So I wanted to hear, because we're going to do more of these questions at the end, because I asked a lot of people on social media and in my world just sort of what they would want to ask you. And a lot of people wanted to know about 12 steps versus the kind of thing that I did, or people who say that they worked through their church and somehow got support that way. But when it comes to the pathway out of something like an alcohol abuse problem, do you feel like we know pretty well what works? Has AA shown us what works, or is there another way forward for certain people?
So let's start by underscoring something that you said, which is there's a spectrum of severity in how serious people's substance use problems are. The majority of people who have a drinking problem, say, and get better, will never go to anything. They will not go to treatment. They will not go to AA, the big majority.
They're like me. They just make a decision and somehow stick to it.
Or their environment changes. I mean, let's not fall entirely into the individualistic model. So
right. That's funny. That is my impulse. But you're right. I'm thinking my environment. When I developed my drinking habits, I was single. I was living in New York. I was out a lot. I was doing all that stuff. When I quit, I was a dad. I was working a job where I had to wake up at crazy hours. You're right. My environment was very different.
Absolutely. And I think about that. I'm here on a college campus, right? So like all college campuses, there's a significant number of students who drink too much to the point of, real harm, but if you ask me, we should get them all in alcohol treatment, I go, no. Once they get out of college and it's no longer, you slept into noon, you party animal. It's noon, you were supposed to be here at 8 for your job. You need to talk to your boss. And when they meet a nice boy, a nice girl, and they get some structure, and then they start to have kids, and they want to be a good parent. All that stuff. There's a huge amount of people just. Phrase often used mature out. That's a little, I think, patronizing. But just, the rewards and costs of all these substances are relative to everything else in our life. What other rewards do we have? What other costs would we pay? And one thing I like to do with new psychiatric residents, people in training, is I'll say, let's say you're going to deal with patients who are doing all this stuff. Let's say I put the most fabulous, drug, whatever one you want to try, in front of you. If you wouldn't try it or you wouldn't keep using it, why not? And you give lots of reasons. Well, I'm going to be a physician. I'm here at Stanford. It's so beautiful out. There's all this other stuff I want to do. I love my kids. It's like, okay, well, not everybody has all that stuff, right? And the brain makes these judgments relatively, right? So it's harder in a resource, impoverished environment, to stop using or not start using than it is in a resource-rich environment. And so that's going to influence whether people recover, again, no matter what they seek. So let's go back to your question. So Alcoholics Anonymous, when I started my career, which is now sort of roughly during the Taft administration,
he's kidding, everybody.
Yes. It was actually Benjamin Harrison, a great man. He inspired us all.
You and your muskets, and your terrible tobacco.
That's right. Yeah. So I was a research assistant at a medical school in Michigan, and I heard about Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was just asking. I met a member. It's like, you do what exactly? You sit in a group, and I said, so these are like doctors? No, just. I said, you take medication? No, take. So there's trade, and I just thought, God, that sounds really stupid. That could not possibly work, right? And
because what your training had taught you?
Well, my training, probably my mentors. It was sort of de rigueur. The professors were all contemptuous of things like that. There's this sort of snobbery of medicine, and I think also for me there was, I'm just going to work really, really hard for years and years and years to get clinical training, and then you amateurs are going to go do it just for free on your own, and so there was all those feelings, And
you mean they do this without adult supervision, without expert supervision?
Without me?
Without me in the room?
Who do they think they are, right?
Right.
And but fortunately, I was, I guess, not so far along in my education that I was incapable of learning. And one of them said, "Do you want to come see this, Mr. Smarty Pants?" And so you can go to what's called an open meeting, and I watched it, and I was really impressed with the humanity and the kindness and the wisdom. And as we were gathering lots of data on this study, I ended up doing my master's thesis on these groups. And lo and behold, people were getting, dramatically more likely to be doing well, people with substance problems, if they were in these groups. And then, those were early correlational studies, but later me, but also lots of other people did, pretty sophisticated randomized trials with, the best kind of evidence with, this population, that population. And AA just keeps coming out really well. So it is a very good intervention. Now, what that does not mean, what some people hear when I say that is, you mean every single person who drinks too much has to go to AA, or you should feel bad if you went to AA and it didn't work for you. There is nothing like that in addiction. There is nothing like that. Okay. It's like, we've already talked baseball. I'll talk a little more, right? A baseball player who won in 3 times. What do you call a player? Two-thirds of the times he strikes out, but the third time he gets a hit. What do you call him? You call him an all-star. It's the hardest thing in sports is to hit a baseball, right? So that's a good hit rate. So if addiction is hard. to treat, especially it's among people who have already tried everything they can outside of the treatment system and not been able to do it. So, if when something works well, that absolutely does not mean most people instantly get better. There's still plenty of people who relapse over and over, and it's okay that AA doesn't help everybody, because there's nothing else. That's just generally true across health, right? There's lots of interventions help different people. So thankfully, I'm glad there are some other things. There are medications like acamprosate and naltrexone. There's psychotherapies. You mentioned religious involvement. Some people reconnect with the faith community, or really, I would say, any community that gives you lots of fun stuff to do around other people that is not centered on drinking. So that could be your exercise group, your jogging group, your musical group, where you need to show up and be sharp. And if you were drinking, you get in trouble. That kind of stuff really matters. And it shouldn't surprise us, because I guess if you thought of any other health behavior, if I told you I'd really like to take up jogging, and I said, so there's a group of joggers I'm going to hang around with, you may say, well, yeah. I mean, role models, hope, makes it more fun.
Great idea. That's right.
Some accountability.
Sure.
They'll say, hey, kid, we're running on Tuesday. Where are you, man? We're waiting here for you. So, all of those things can be very powerful, but not enough for everyone. That's why I'm glad we have things like, the medications that, there are people who do very well on medication who don't do well on, the kind of social stuff they don't like. And the last thing is recovery. I'm sorry to interrupt, but also recovery can look different. So for some people, it's I cannot ever drink ever again. There's also a pool of people whose drinking problem, it's bad, but not super bad. And they eventually become moderate drinkers. So
that's just what I was about to ask is what role is there, so far we've been talking about this binary construct. You've got a problem or you've gotten off that thing entirely. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're going to talk more about this down the line, because so much of life is about moderation these days, now that almost everything is an addictive product. So in alcohol abuse, what do we know about moderation? I remember once upon a time when I was first thinking about my own drinking, somebody told me about, I may be making this up, but I think it was called moderation.org or something. Something.
Management.
It was a European thing that they were telling me about, that there was some sort of that it was a big thing in Europe to try to steer drinking away from habitual and more to celebratory and social. There was something about that sort of was working. Is that a thing?
Yeah, there's lots of ways they should do that. And I mentioned moderation management because it's a self-help program I actually studied after I did some AA studies, because I was curious about it. And if you compare AA members and MM members, which I did, they differ in exactly the way the literature would lead you to expect, which is the severity of the addiction was much greater for the people in AA. So if you just, on any dimension, you say, how much, what is a big day of drinking for you? It might be, like it's a fifth of vodka or 30 beers on a football Saturday.
Right, a potentially deadly dose of alcohol.
Yeah.
Right.
And I have shakes, and I have blackouts times I can't remember, and I wake up craving a drink. Whereas people in moderation management would be like, well, for you, it's like, well, I'm drinking 6 bottles of wine a week, over, with maybe like a bottle and a half a night. And so, some trouble, but very few of them, blackout, shakes, tremens, that kind of thing. The other thing is the social stability. So the people who were coming in moderation management were overwhelmingly still had the job, still had someone who loved them. And
had not fallen through the floor, had not given up the essentials of survival for this.
They hadn't burned out their whole life. They tend to be a bit more educated as well. Whereas a lot of people come into AA or into alcohol treatment pretty much alone, because the people who love them have just can't take it anymore.
People I know who've been through AA talk about the floor. You have found the floor, and that you keep, and they'll say about other people who are considering changing their habit, they haven't found their floor yet, so they're not ready for the 12 steps. So that's interesting. But you're talking about people for whom you don't have to actually hit the floor, the base of your life.
Yeah, I mean, and the floor is not the same. I mean, there's an AA, the hitting bottom thing, but we clearly, human beings have different things that they consider hitting bottom.
Right.
So for one person, it's, I had to burn out my marriage, my job, my health, and be homeless. But for another person, it's, at the office Christmas party, I stood up and gave a drunken speech, humiliated myself, and I just have never drunk again because that just
Right. I got told off by my boss, and that's the worst thing that I could
that's
possibly
worse.
imagine.
I got pulled over one drink driving. I actually knew somebody like this, and it was like a drink driving arrest, jolt, shock, and never drank again. But he was, again, though, someone who was not as physically dependent and had a lot of social support around him, sort of help him make that change, which not everybody has.
So now that we're looking past, there's alcohol, and then and you taught me to think about. I've talked to many people, and you were one of them who were sort of talking to me about the lessons that we have learned from alcohol as an industry and as in terms of its social effects. And then the rise of cannabis now as a business, right? And at the time that it was first being legalized, again, this was a time when you and I were when I first met you, there was this broad sense, I think it's still a broad sense, that cannabis is very harmless, right? There aren't a lot of deaths associated with it. In fact, I would argue there's almost no deaths associated with it. It doesn't seem to invite much in the way of violence. There's impaired driving, but typically the impaired driving happens when you combine booze and alcohol, not necessarily, booze and cannabis, not necessarily just cannabis. So, but you turned me on to the notion that there's going to be a subset of people that are going to be very badly affected for this, and we may not be ready for that or thinking about them at all. And in that past year or so, I've seen more and more literature come out saying, oh, there are effects here.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering where your head's at when it comes to where we're at with cannabis.
Yeah, it's very common to hear smart people say, if we just made these things legal, we wouldn't have all these problems. And whenever someone says that, I always say, look at alcohol and look at tobacco. Together, that's 10 million human beings a year who lose their lives to those just two. Whereas every single illegal drug together, it's about 700,000 people a year, versus 10 million.
Wow, is that true? Alcohol and tobacco together, 10 million versus everything. The ones that we talk about, fentanyl and the rest of it, all of that is less than 1 million people.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Right. And that doesn't mean I don't mean to say it's the end of the argument, right? There's other things you can say, well, what about liberty, civil rights, all that, those are all important conversations to have. But just the idea that when it's legal, the damage will go away. No, when it's legal, you just get a different set of problems to wrestle with. And one of them you get, and to be clear, by legal, I don't just mean not punishing users, which we usually call as decriminalization, but legal saying we're going to let a company manufacture, refine, promote, advertise this product. What do they do? They say, okay, how do we make this more addictive? How do we make it more available? How do we get more advertising? And they're very good at it. And also, how do we get our lobbyists to make the regulations light and the taxes light? And all of that has happened with cannabis. So the cannabis that was around 30, 40 years ago was about typically 3-4% THC. That's a principal intoxicant. Studies of legal markets now show that its average product's about 20%, right?
Wow.
Which makes sense to a seller, right? Because it's like, wow, this is, it's more potent. So it'll get
better product,
more, and then more addictive. And that's another interesting change is if you go back again 30, 40 years ago, the modal person might have been using once a week. And now, slightly over 40% of people who use cannabis in the United States use it every day or almost every single day. Suggesting.
Well, say that percentage again?
It's about 42% of American cannabis smokers, or users, I should say, not just smokers, users, use it every day or almost every single day.
Wow, 40% of people who are using weed in some form are doing it daily.
Yeah. So you multiply those two things together. If you go from the 30 years ago modal person once a week of 3 to 4 or 5% versus every day or almost every day at 20%, that's about a 65-fold increase.
Yeah. And does that track to booze? Do we know what the percentages are of daily drinkers?
Well, what's really interesting is that there used to be many more times as many daily drinkers as daily cannabis users. But just this last year, as my colleague Jonathan Calkins pointed out, cannabis has passed booze. So there are more daily cannabis users than drinkers. Now, one argument that was made is, well, once people discover cannabis, they're going to stop using or use less alcohol and opioids. And this turned out not to be true. It was pushed. The industry pushed that a lot. The other interesting thing about it is that people argue, this is going to be different than the alcohol and tobacco industry. Well, at least in Canada, which has, unlike us, a fully nationalized industry, the two biggest investors in the cannabis industry are the alcohol and the tobacco industry.
Right. So, well, I mean, that's right. That's right.
Of course, they're going to follow the playbook.
Yeah, I meet over and over again. I've met people in the cannabis industry who, as the industry has grown, become more industrialized and become more sophisticated, they just hire in the supply chain people from Philip Morris and these other R.G. Reynolds and these other big tobacco companies, because it is the same business. You grow a thing, you turn it into a product, you
Absolutely.
and you try to shape behavior with it. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, when we come back, I want to talk about technology and whether we can be addicted in the sense that Keith's been talking about to our phones. We'll be right back. Okay, I want to tell you a story that for me was a big eye-opener. This was, God, when was this? This was probably 2015, 2014 maybe. I was invited to a dinner, a kind of informal dinner by a group of tech people who would read peer-reviewed behavior papers, and a lot of them were former behavioral scientists, graduate students or whatever, who had then moved into tech, making typically apps. And I went to this dinner. I talk about this in my book, The Loop. And at the dinner, the speakers were, and it was it was pizza and beer, but it was these two guys got up to talk about their new consultancy that they were just starting, and they were newly minted addiction experts. They were PhD addiction guys, and they had just come out of, I think it was USC or something. I can't remember, but they were there to talk about how the brain forms habits. And they described some work that their colleagues had done that they had spent a lot of time with, which showed that if you took people who had been addicted to cocaine and went to the club a lot, used it in nightclubs. If you took people who had gone through recovery and were no longer doing cocaine, but you brought them to the club and you boomed the music at them and you shone the strobes on them, and then you showed them a mirror with lines of baking soda on it, and you said, "This is baking soda." And then you asked them, from 0 to 10, what would you rate your desire to snort what you know to be baking soda? They would typically report like, it's a 20. It's like a 12. Their desire for it was off the charts. And these guys basically said, it goes to show that you can shape people's desire for your product if you build the environment right and the reinforcements right and so forth. And that's why we are offering our services to you, app builders, and our consultancy's name, I kid you not, was dopamine. That was literally what they called themselves, dopamine. It was the most cynical thing I'd ever seen. And they went on to be profiled by, I should have written them up at the time and I didn't. And 60 Minutes did a profile on them later to basically just show like what a nightmare technology is becoming. And I've been on TikTok before we had this conversation, and on Instagram talking to people about what they want to know, about from you. And so many of them, right, are all about, what is this relationship that I have with my phone? What is this relationship that I have with social media? And so I want to hear just sort of your broad feelings about, like, as someone who really sees people fall through the floor of their lives, who truly lose everything to these addictions and sometimes even their lives. What is it like to hear everybody being so anxious about their relationship with technology right now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons to be anxious. You can't really be addicted to your phone or the internet per se, because it's a medium more than a thing, right? So, the internet could be the thing that, you fill out a job application for when you're unemployed, or it could be the thing where you watch TikTok for 3 hours and miss the job interview that you had, right? So it's like, in what is it specifically that you're doing? But the ability to generate really unhealthy relationships with technology, I think the phone is, many good things about it, but for this particular thing, it really is like the nuclear bomb, right? Because almost everything else, it is easy to get away from. And the fact that it is now normative to carry these things and look at them all the time, and it never seems weird to do that, even when people are, having dinner together. People are like,
you can't even have certain jobs without having a phone. That's right.
That's another part, is that it becomes essential. I mean, I just say this, like, as a parent, we greatly limited screen time, with our sons until the pandemic. And then it became impossible for all kids because the school was over the internet. And so, once it becomes, that was an example of sort of like moving in adult life where there is no choice but to be on screens all day. And that was, I think, transformative. Like, and also as parents, we're like, we can't say no because you're not going to learn your lessons anymore. And that's only gotten more and more so. I mean, I noticed that, I was traveling through Germany or something, and I needed my phone to get on the plane. I mean, they wouldn't take a paper ticket, right? So, and to do my banking and all this kind of stuff. So that's great if you're making an addictive product because people have no choice but to basically walk through the liquor store on the way to the place they want to go, or walk through the gambling casino, the place you want to go. It's just like, at the grocery store, milk's always at the back and all the candy is by the register. It's that same principle. Like, nobody gets milk without walking by the candy. And that's what these phones are. So it's sort of it's a challenge for people who are trying to not start developing those habits, but also those who are trying to quit those habits. That I got to keep going by the candy every time, my spouse says, what should we have for dinner tonight? I'm looking at this thing that could be the same place where I look at, whatever, the porn I can't stop looking at, the gambling I can't stop doing, or the stupid video game that I do so much that I at risk of wrecking my car.
And do you believe that there is or is there any evidence yet that the increased exposure is somehow making us more susceptible to forms of addiction? Are we becoming more prone to addiction because we're engaging in so much reinforcement behavior?
That's a really good question at the population level. I don't think we know that answer yet. I mean, there's some, some evidence, but it's all sort of ecological evidence, meaning at the population level, the individual level, make changes in attention span and expectations of reward. And so you can imagine if this is in fact happening, that people are coming having harder and harder time, say, persisting through something for 5 or 10 minutes to get a reward versus getting one in 20 seconds. You could imagine that shortening of time span, or temporal discounting as it's sometimes called, might make us more prone to all types of addictions. Things I think of, like, some deeply, I still I barely watch television, and I love reading long books, right? And that's a function of my generation sort of growing up.
You were alive during the Taft administration.
Yeah, I was. But now, so whatever the pleasure is of a really long book or something, I notice that young people just don't read the same way. That's too boring.
Also, they've been conditioned to believe it's not. I just was talking to a guy the other day he's a professor of literature at UC Berkeley, and he was teaching a class on reading literature deeply. Mm-hmm. He said that his number one difficulty is convincing his students that there is an intellectual difference between having read the book and having had ChatGPT tell you what the book was about.
Yeah.
That he thinks that they've come into the class believing those things are identical, and he has to spend months trying to disabuse them of that.
So that's very interesting. So if that is happening broadly, and I say, I don't want to, we do tend to panic about new technology, so I don't want to just say I know this to be true. But let's say if that is happening broadly, and we will find out as a generation grows up who has never known anything else but this technology, then you could easily imagine that we've been talking for 20 seconds and I haven't had a brain hit. Give me a cigarette, or I can't pay attention to you. I'm going to go look at my little gadget or whatever, and that would be pretty tragic for our species, and I hope we don't end up in that place.
Right. And do you think that there is if we've learned that there were categories of people, here's my worry. As you were describing earlier in our earlier segment about alcohol in moderation being possible for some people, and then total abstinence being necessary for other people, and now we're in a world in which everyone's expected to somehow manage their relationship to technology as an addictive substrate. There are clearly going to be some people who can't handle it, right? That's what drugs have taught us about everything, about everybody, right? In the same way that I can't drink, I'm not totally convinced. I'm the guy on TikTok where the woman comes up eventually from TikTok and says on my screen, "You've had enough and you should go to bed," when the drug dealer tells you that you've had enough, you know you are addicted, and you know that they know you'll be back tomorrow, right? And so I'm not sure I'm that guy. Like, I'm not sure I'm a moderation management tech person. And yet here I am.
Okay, that's such a great question, because it isn't like fentanyl and it isn't like alcohol in that we really can't limit it. I mean, it's literally traveling through the air all around us.
Right. You got to do heroin to be in the modern world is where we're at.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So it's incredibly difficult. I mean, the one place I think there is a public policy move and a public policy consensus, and this goes back to brain development. When do most addictions start? Overwhelmingly, they start when people have young brains. It's teenage or early adulthood, or in some unfortunate cases, kids are exposed really young, even like 8, 9, 10. But usually, walk up to a 50-year-old smoker and say, "When did you start smoking?" It'd be an incredibly rare person to say, "I started when I was 45." It's going to be more likely 15. So I do notice, some consensus about, could we at least have during the day while kids are at school, them not being exposed to this all day long. Now, the aggregate effect of that could be very good, because they're developing, their brains are developing, they're rapidly acquiring things, so they can maybe learn to appreciate that book rather than hearing it summarized by ChatGPT. And that also solves the collective action problem, which is really huge. Is like, to be the one person who doesn't have a phone is very difficult, right? Because then you can't socialize, you may not find out about things you want to attend. But if everybody's like, okay, that's just not how, you have to actually talk to somebody. Like, if you want to date, you have to actually ask a person to their face, for example. Then people will learn to develop those skills in a way they don't have to when it's just a phone.
One thing I sort of maybe I'll take some encouragement from then is, in your 2023 book about addiction, you talk about the set point, that you're
right.
The place where your brain responds most strongly to the drug can move as you develop tolerance, or then you lose that tolerance over time, or whatever it is. And that, once upon a time you do a drug and it takes you to a 10, and then eventually you're doing a drug just to get back to where you had started, which was at a 5.
Right.
So I assume you can do the opposite, right? Like you describe having patients who've gone to methadone clinics in order to try to reset their set point for heroin. I wonder if there's something like that for us with if the lesson here is that there is a way to change your set point with technology. If there is a way to bring it back down, I guess I'm not even sure what we're hoping for, but I wonder if there's some lessons there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's often a useful thing to do for oneself for health, but also just diagnostically, to take a break from something that we're worried we're doing too much, no matter what it is. So even if, I know I'm always going to use my phone, but like, I'm going to do a phone-free weekend. Or my colleague Anna Lemke, who's wrote this wonderful book, Dopamine Nation, which touches a lot of the stuff we're talking about. She mentioned her family agreed to take a technology-free vacation. And
you know what I like about that? It reminds me of AA or the running club, right? It's the social support that does. We're built. Our circuitry as humans is built to take cues from other people around the campfire. Right. And so maybe if there's some way of, joining up and saying, we're going to have a 19th century weekend with our friends or our family, maybe that's the trick.
Yeah. Well, social relationships, I mean, again, they should be evolutionarily conserved, because, there's this sort of funny thing about, in a wealthy, rich, ridiculously rich society, America, you can really be the individual who sets out on their own. But for most of the history of Homo sapiens, the person who set out on their own quickly gets eaten by a lion or something like that, right? You have to work together. And that's partly why, our survival instinct to maintain our relationships. And one thing she told in the story I just absolutely loved, she said, it wasn't just when they were in the car, they were talking because they didn't have their phones. It's they weren't thinking about, we need to stop so I can get to my phone. Or as soon as I get to the hotel, I'm going to start looking at my phone. And it just sort of became out of it, and I think that would be an interesting experiment for everyone to do. And like, could we do it or not? Who's really in charge here? And I just quote one other person. So I wrote a book about treating drinking problems with Anne Langford Hughes, who's a psychiatrist in the UK. And she asks her patients about when treating alcohol patients, who's in control? Is it you or is it the alcohol? And she says, very diagnostic, because people will kind of realize, like, well, pretty much the alcohol. Or is it me? Do I feel like I can say no anytime, or no after 1 or 2, or no because I got something that's important to me or important to my family tonight, or not? And when we're at that situation, I think with, say, a phone, feels like I don't even like this and I'm still doing it. I know I need to stop. Then, then I should think that sounds a lot more like addiction, doesn't it?
That's when you've walked right across the line. That's so interesting. Keith Humphreys, thank you so much for being here on The Rip Current. I really appreciate it.
Really good to talk to you.
The Rip Current podcast is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you would like to see more of this kind of content, you can read and watch and listen to all sorts of things at theripcurrent.com. And if you like this show, do me a favor. Go into the Apple Podcast app, or into whatever app you're using to listen to this, and not only should you like it, but if you wouldn't mind sharing it with someone and leaving a review, that is the best possible way to get this to a new audience. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you listening.